So I recently got back from 5 months in Botswana, which is a country in southern Africa, and I was there primarily doing two things. I was leading a study abroad program. I had 14 students from these colleges that are members of the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. So I was directing that program. I taught two courses as part of that program, and directed or led a number of excursions on weekends and at midterm break with those students. The other thing I was doing research on food insecurity or hunger. I had the help of two graduate students from the University of Botswana, and we conducted 160 household interviews, both in the city of Gaborone, in surrounding peri-urban areas, and then in two villages. And Botswana's an interesting country in the sense that has very humble beginnings. It became independent in 1966. It was a British protectorate. It was kind of a backwater, poor colony. But soon after independence, they discovered diamonds, and they have husbanded that diamond resource very carefully. Today, they're the largest exporter of precious diamonds in the world, and a lot of that revenue they've used to invest in infrastructure, in education, in healthcare. So today, Botswana is a middle-income country. So I was very interested in looking at a successful development situation, a middle-income African country where hunger persists. And they face a particular challenge in the sense that they import 90% of their food. A lot of it comes from South Africa. And global food prices have been increasing steadily since 2000. They spiked in 2008. Again in 2011, 2012, they surpassed the 2008 levels. So there are high food prices in a country which is prosperous yet has a very inequitable income distribution. It has the second most inequitable income distribution in the world after Namibia. So you have a segment of that population which is poor, which is struggling to pay for food, and kind of faces chronic food insecurity. So that's what we were examining on the research side.
Can you put this situation with the recent increases in food prices into sort of longer historical context?
Sure.
I mean, what's involved in feeding an African country, and how does one make sense? What are the big concepts one needs to understand that?
Sure, it's a really good question, and I think there are at least two pieces to this. One, what's going on globally and what has been the history of kind of food prices globally. And food prices were higher in the 1960s and 70s. We went through a period of low food prices in the 80s and 90s, historically very low. And then, as I mentioned, they've risen gradually since 2000. A lot of people think about global population growth as lying behind this. That's a small part of the dynamic. More significant is the fact that the world is urbanizing at a very rapid clip. The world is now over 50% urban, and when people move to cities, their dietary patterns tend to change. They consume a greater variety of foods, they consume more meat. It takes about 10 kilograms of grain to produce a kilogram of beef. So as the world is urbanizing, it's putting more stress on the global food system. And then also, I think shorter term, what we saw in 2008, and then again more recently, is rising global energy prices. And food production today is an incredibly energy-intensive process, much more so than it was in the past. So you need fossil fuels not only for the mechanization of agriculture, but a lot of your inputs, your fertilizers, your pesticides, are petroleum based. So when fuel prices went up, food prices went up. And along with that, when food prices went up, when energy prices went up, it made things like ethanol more competitive. More people invested in ethanol production. So in the upper Midwest, this is based on corn largely. So that even put more pressure on the global food system. Plus, there was some financial speculation that was going on. It was worthwhile to invest in, speculate on food markets. So that globally has, those are kind of longer term and shorter term reasons for food prices to rise. In the African context, I think there is, since the period of European colonialism, which starts in the late 19th century moving forward, the European powers have been interested in kind of dismantling subsistence food production systems, that is food production for the local population, and reoriented that towards the global economy. And they did a lot of that through taxation. So if you introduce something like a head tax, households then need cash to pay that tax. And the only way they were going to get that cash was by either growing cash crops or by migrating and working. So people gradually produce less food for local consumption. They produce more cash crops for exports, some edible, some not edible, and they began migrating to work in either the mines or in commercial farms or in urban areas. So what we see then is sub-Saharan Africa has become increasingly involved in the cash economy. They're producing less and less of their own food, and they're acquiring that through income they've generated through other means. I think particularly pernicious in the last few years is we've seen the kind of offloading of other regions' food insecurity onto Africa. So when global food prices went up in 2008, for example, a lot of Middle Eastern countries, North African countries, Asian countries, which historically imported a lot of their food, tried to circumvent the market by acquiring long-term leases to land in Africa for the production of food that was destined for their economies. So I think that history, that increasing engagement with the global food market, this recent history of land grabs or long-term land leases has made many regions of Africa more susceptible to hunger or food insecurity.
Well, is there any non-diabolical rationale for developed countries pressing to make African countries more susceptible to global food prices in the global market? In other words, this undercutting of subsistence farming, of the sort of off the books gardening and farming that could in fact could make the global cycles hurt less. Why? What rationale? I mean, one can certainly see from the standpoint of a company that's trying to sell food why you don't want people to have an alternative in their backyard. But certainly nobody's going to say that in public. So what is said in public about why you undercut subsistence agriculture?
So I think a neoclassical economist would tell you that different areas of the world have different comparative advantages. And so if you're particularly good at producing precious diamonds, or you're particularly good at producing cotton or or producing tobacco or producing beef. That's what you should specialize in. So focus on producing those things which you're very efficient at producing. Take that income and then purchase food with it. And then, everybody does what they're most efficient at, and then everybody wins. You trade, and we all come out better. I think there are a couple of complicating factors. It exposes you to a lot of risks, because usually what happens is your economy becomes more simplified over time, so you're concentrated in a few areas. And if those areas crash, you see your revenue plummet, but you still have to kind of deal with these food costs. So with, for example, the global economic slowdown, Botswana is a major exporter of precious diamonds. There's just less money in the global economy. People aren't buying as many diamonds, so Botswana saw its revenues drop. I think the other issue that you have to manage is that the rise and fall of food prices doesn't always happen with the rise and fall of whatever you're producing in terms of price. So I think a number of African countries have actually been in situations where they're producing a commodity that lots of other countries produce. There's overproduction. The price for that is dropping, while their food costs recently have been rising. So their revenues are going less far in terms of food purchases. And so if you're a subsistence producer, you, in a sense, you don't have to deal with these kind of vagaries and risks of the market, because irrespective of rising and falling prices, you will always have your food. I think the other kind of related to this same neoclassical economic argument is this notion that small subsistence producers are inefficient. There are a lot of stereotypes about African farmers as being kind of backward and primitive, so that they would argue, I think, that it makes most sense for large commercial producers using kind of the latest technologies to produce food. They can do that more efficiently, and then those farms get big, they displace the smallhold producers who become workers and then will buy that food. The evidence isn't really there to support the fact that large commercial producers are always more efficient. And I think what we've seen is that these large commercial producers, because they use more energy-intensive technologies, those, like I noted earlier, those food prices are going to go up when energy prices go up. And so you've got these workers making low wages that are going to struggle to feed themselves. So in all these different scenarios, it tends to be the small worker whose food security situation is compromised.
I was just thinking about insurance. I mean, the amount we pay for insurance is totally non-productive money. I mean, it just goes into a hole until we need it. Mm-hmm. But Archer Daniels Midland has insurance. Mm-hmm. Everybody has insurance, and they don't expect their insurance money to yield, yearly returns. It's calculated very differently. Mm-hmm. If one thinks about one's subsistence capacity as insurance, it doesn't have to produce very much to make excellent economic sense.
I think you're spot on. I think a lot of small subsistence producers have been kind of characterized as risk averse in a very negative way. And I think what they're trying to do is manage risk. So, one strategy is to produce one crop and aim for maximum production in a good year, but then everything fails in a bad year. So a lot of small producers are not going to maximize production in any given year, but they're planting lots of different crops on lots of different soil types in hopes that in any given year something will work out and they'll do okay. And on a strictly kind of cost-benefit analysis, that may not look particularly efficient, but it kind of works like your insurance analogy, that you know, they're managing the risk. They don't suffer the devastating losses.
Well, when you talk about classical economics, it sounds like it's the sort of bird's eye view of at the highest policy level, at the highest level of abstraction. And I know that you have experience with Western folks who have real field experience, who are on the ground, who know the complexities of trying to live with a market that's doing this up and down stuff, and that's out of the control of the locals entirely. So how are people, say, in U.S. aid agencies thinking about their role, say, in Botswana, as they watch this? I mean, you have this argument from on high about classical economics and producing what you're best at producing. You see stuff on the ground that's a little, that doesn't quite match that. How are people thinking as they try to sort of, be of assistance to these countries?
So I think more broadly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a sense that the first Green Revolution, which was an effort in the 60s and 70s, led by Norman Borlaug, who's a graduate of the University of Minnesota, to take industrial farming techniques developed in the global north, so the combination of hybrid seeds with pesticides and fertilizers, and bring these to the global south, the tropical areas of the world. And so that led to tremendous yield increases, particularly in Mexico and some areas of South Asia. It's not to say that it wasn't done at great social cost. There was a lot of farmers that went out of business as a result of that. But big producers did produce more. And there were also environmental concerns about insect populations becoming resistant to pesticides, for example. But that first Green Revolution had less of an impact in the African context, in part because they didn't really focus on crops that were major African crops. So one big focus was on wheat. There's very little wheat grown in the African context, as well as on Asian rice, but it's different than a lot of the African rice varieties that are grown. So there's been a big push in the last few years in the wake of the 2000 global aid food crisis to bring a new green revolution to Africa. And so to, these same sorts of packages of hybrid seeds, pesticides, fertilizers, increasing use of GMO, genetically modified seeds, to increase crop yields. And I think the issue there is, while that will increase total production, it won't necessarily solve the hunger problem, because those types of technologies tend not to be accessible to the poorest of the poor. Furthermore, as noted before, you're in a way setting people up for a system that is closely linked to energy prices. So, if the poor can't afford them, but the rich can, the big farmers become bigger, the small farmers become smaller or go out of business, they become dependent on a market, and then those food prices go up when energy prices go up. Now, in the particular case of Botswana, which is not a big agricultural producer, so Botswana it's largely the Kalahari Desert, so it's a semi-arid country. And the pillars of that economy are grass-fed beef production, high-end ecotourism, and precious diamond production. So I think the advice in the case of Botswana is you should focus on those industries. Don't worry too much about agricultural production because you can import this food from elsewhere, namely South Africa. So Botswana, from the early 90s, abandoned a policy of food self-sufficiency. That is an attempt to try to produce the food it needs within its borders, and instead has relied on a food security policy that you're going to make enough revenue to buy adequate calories to feed your population. And I think the issue there is that in a resource-dependent economy, though that wealth tends not to be distributed very evenly, so it's a highly inequitable country. So you have this poor population that is dependent on food imports. So what do you do when that food gets expensive? Now Botswana, to its credit, has a pretty extensive set of state subsidies, so to help the poorest of the poor. But a lot of people are saying now that the government can't sustain that indefinitely, these supports to the poor. And so I think we may be at a point where we need to begin to think about agriculture in a slightly different way. That it's not just about producing food, but it's also a livelihood, it's a safety net for the poorest of the poor, and that it's worthwhile investing in an approach to agriculture that's that is accessible to the poor in order to avoid or to minimize hunger amongst that segment of the population.
So does the view you just expressed have a public in Botswana? I mean, are there people who represent that, or is the political setup such that other views dominate?
I think there's an increasing recognition that inequality and poverty is a problem. And so how do you diversify the economy and enfranchise the poorest of the poor? So I think there's an interest in that, but I don't think it's been worked out completely, how exactly one accomplishes that. And I think we're on the cusp of beginning to think about agriculture differently as well. I think up until now, agriculture has been thought of an economic activity that needs to be modernized, okay, and less of as a social safety net.
Mm-hmm. So when people think about poverty as a problem, it's sort of a problem how or a problem for whom? Mm-hmm. I mean, if one's a compassionate person, it's a problem in one way. Mm-hmm. If one needs people's votes, it's a problem in another way. Mm-hmm. If people are likely to burn the capital, it's a problem in a third way. If Marxists are likely to organize in the hills, it's a problem in a fourth way. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I can imagine all sorts of ways. And if the poor are totally powerless and one is totally happy with one's life, it may be a problem in no way. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, how is poverty emerging as a problem, do you think, in the political context of a country like Botswana?
So let me just address your second to last point first, which is, I do think sometimes poverty is a social construction to the extent that, if we define poverty in terms of monetary income earned, we there's a temptation to look at a subsistence farmer and call he or she poor, when in fact maybe they're only earning $200 a year, but they have a very good life, they're producing enough food to feed their family, and they don't suffer from hunger. Okay? So I think a lot of conventional definitions of poverty really focus on a numeric, monetized understanding of poverty, which isn't always appropriate. Now that said, in the context of Botswana, we do have an increasingly monetized economy. And I think at the end of the day, if human welfare is significantly compromised, particularly in a context where a country is relatively well off, it's a middle income country, there are enough resources to go around, a lot of people would say that that's ethically unacceptable. If one group is leading a very comfortable life and another group is suffering from nutrition deficiencies, that's just not right. So politicians, I would hope at some level, recognize that that's ethically unacceptable. They're probably thinking about votes as well. And I've also got to believe that there's an element of concern about social stability. And when a society becomes too deeply unequal, that can lead to social instability. And just to, when I was in Botswana, over these 5 months, I think 2 things happened that really brought that point home. Mali, which is a country in West Africa where I worked for many, many years, lived there for about 8 years. There was a coup d'etat in late March. A democratically elected president who was about to step down in a month was overthrown by a military coup. And I think part of what was going on there was a lot of concerns about corruption and the persistence of poverty, and a few people doing extremely well. I don't think that justifies the coup, but you could argue that social instability was part of what led to that event. And Mali has completely fallen apart. So when I was in Botswana, I think I was very cognizant of what happened in Mali, and in a sense grew really to appreciate the political stability that I experienced in Botswana. Closer to Botswana, its neighbor, South Africa, I think also has experienced, in the period when I was there, a lot of social unrest related to the persistence of inequality. So, South Africa as well is a deeply unequal country, and I think a lot of segments of the South African population are deeply concerned that poverty alleviation has not been a significant concern of the government. So, call it self-preservation, call it political savvy. I do think the Botswana government is concerned about poverty for reasons of social stability, for ethical reasons, so that it will persist as well in leadership.
How connected is are the people in the cities who are doing pretty well to the countryside? Are there family ties, or are there ways in which there's a sort of moat between, in terms of, it's one thing to say people in the country are hungry, or people in the country aren't doing it very well. It's another thing to say my grandma's not doing very well, my cousins aren't doing very well.
Yeah.
What's that picture like?
Yeah, another really good question. So, Botswana historically has very strong urban to rural ties. It was a mostly rural country at independence in 1966. It's also a small country. Today it only has 2 million people, okay, and in a country the size of Texas. So I think Botswana and Mongolia are the two least densely populated countries in the world. So urbanization is definitely a post-colonial phenomenon, but it is a very rapidly urbanizing place. Today it is 60% urban, when it was almost 0% urban at independence. So most people who live in the city today, either spent part of their childhood in a rural area or definitely have relatives who still live in a rural community or in the village. And if you walk up and talk to any Botswana, that's a citizen of Botswana, they even if they spent their entire life in Gaborone, the capital city, they will tell you that they're from a particular village. There's that sense of identity. Curiously, though, in spite of those strong connections, there is a very strong rural-urban divide in the sense that a lot of the poverty is rural in nature, and a lot of the wealth is concentrated in urban areas. And I think that's somewhat an artifact of the particular pattern of development that we've seen. So diamond wealth, this is what provides the government with most of its revenue, a lot of the infrastructure. While they've developed infrastructure in rural areas, a lot of that infrastructure is concentrated in urban areas, and that's where a lot of the civil service jobs are. So the highest paying jobs tend to be in the city. So that's where we see a lot of that wealth concentrated. And there is some, there are wealth transfers. People send money back to rural areas. What we see a lot of is people building homes in rural areas because that's where they want to retire. Or most wealthy people will have a herd of cattle. And so wealth tends to be banked in the form of cattle, and then that cattle is kept in rural areas where it's tended by livestock hands.
I'm reminded of my Chinese students telling me about regulations in China that key all sorts of social benefits to the place you were born. Mm-hmm. So people who come to the city to work maintain a very strong connection to their village, mm-hmm. and by law they have to. They're always sojourners in the cities, mm-hmm. and their plan is to return home, mm-hmm. and so it seems like legislatively China has done something mm-hmm. to block this rural-urban divide, mm-hmm. And it's interesting how much policy can make a difference for that.
Yeah, I think in Botswana it is more cultural. There are not certainly politics and where investments are made influence this, but there's not a set of policies like in China that would reinforce this.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about your research. What questions did you bring to these interviews, and mm-hmm. what did you learn?
So we were really interested in part how poor households were earning money, both in urban, peri-urban, and rural contexts. And by peri-urban, I'm talking about kind of suburban areas around the city, although many of these peri-urban areas tend to be quite poor in Botswana. Where were they getting their money from? How were they spending their money? What proportion of their household budget were they spending on food? And then really what happened when food prices went up. So we were asking lots of questions about coping, do you simply eat less, or do you switch into lower value foods in order to accommodate that, or do you spend less on other types of expenditures in order to feed the family. And we are also, one of the hypotheses that we were trying to explore is, for example, if urban households are having to spend more on food, does that have knock-on effects in rural areas? Maybe if they have to spend more on food, our thinking was that they'd have less money to send to the rural area, and then that might influence food security in that area. So we've yet to analyze this data. I couldn't give you a definitive answer to some of those issues that we were exploring. But I will say that large numbers of poor urban households spend a very high percentage of their income on food, well over 50%. So that when food prices go up, this is a real problem for them because they're limited in terms of how much more they can spend on food. Somewhat surprisingly, I think we found that rural households as well are more dependent on the market for food than we had anticipated. That food production is fairly anemic, so they're not protected from the market in the way that we thought might have been the case.
I'm curious, how you set out a research project like this.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, what considerations go into your thinking, say, prior to a trip to Botswana, about what you want to ask about, what you want to, what needs this investment? Maybe even in the context of who else is doing research and what your contribution is, or the context of who you are as a person who has these kinds of publication opportunities and these kinds of teaching opportunities. How do you think through your research project in a case like that?
Well, I'll be honest. We had done a similar research project in West Africa. So some colleagues and I had looked at 3 cities, Bamako, Mali, Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, and Banjul in the Gambia, and how they dealt with the 2008 global food crisis. And we were really interested in why there was limited social unrest in Bamako, yet there was a lot of social unrest in Abidjan and Banjul, what some people would call food riots. So we were interested in similar types of questions in Botswana. It's, agriculture and food security is an area I do research in as a geographer. So it made sense to look at them there. And as I kind of mentioned in the introduction, there were a couple of interesting twists. First of all, it's a relatively well-off country. It's a middle-income country, yet it imports a huge amount of its food, 90% of its food. So that seemed to present some interesting differences from the norm for an African country. I do think it's interesting. You kind of develop a research plan, okay? You formulate something, you submit it for funding, you're comparing what how you think this situation compares to what other people have done in terms of research. And then when you get on the ground and actually do the research, things often change. So I had only been to Botswana once before, okay? So I was primarily going there to teach a study abroad program, and this was kind of a secondary activity. So I didn't know much about the mentality and behavior of farmers in Botswana. So when I initially created the set of questions that we were going to ask to people, I assumed that farmers in Botswana would behave like farmers in other areas of Africa that I had worked with. So we had a whole series of questions about, if the price of one crop goes up, do you make adjustments? And so my anticipation was that if the price of sorghum or maize went up, maybe people would grow more of those crops and they would decrease the area devoted to other crops. And what we found in Botswana is that the vast majority of rural interviewees tend to farm the same area every year, regardless of what the market is doing. So they always, for example, farm 5 hectares of land. Also, Botswana's traditionally men take care of cattle and women farm. So farming, crop farming, is very much a female activity. And as agriculture has declined in importance, increasingly most of the farmers in Botswana are literally old women. So there's a labor issue. A lot of older female farmers in Botswana will get grants from the government which allow them to pay somebody to come in and plow their land for them, and then they will sow the seeds. So it's they're farming in a way that kind of minimizes the amount of labor they need to furnish in the farming enterprise. And these are things that, until I started interviewing farmers, I had little to no understanding of. So while I was there, that, my questions evolved as my understanding of farming in Botswana became clearer or more refined.
So you didn't continue to ask the questions that you knew were going to have no interesting answers.
After 20 people tell you that they don't do this, you get wise to the fact.
So how does that work, revising a research program on the ground? I mean, you have these commitments, somebody funded you. How does that work? I mean, can you just rewrite the program, recast the hypotheses? Late at night after you realize that you've got a dry well here?
I mean, to their credit, I think most funders realize that once you get into the field and begin looking more closely at a question, that things may shift. We continued to work in the same general area, in thematic area, but the types of questions we were asking shifted slightly.
Well, let me just ask it this. Suppose that tomorrow you saw in calls for proposals an opportunity to do research in your area in some country you'd never worked in before. And it looked as if this grant was had your name on it. Very likely that if you wrote the proposal, you'd get the grant, you'd be able to do the work. Given your experience in Botswana, would your preparation be different? Or is it just necessary that the grant get rewritten on the ground?
I mean, I think I'm fortunate in the sense that I'm a full professor. I don't have to bring in lots of grants to maintain my position. So for me, getting grant money doesn't really drive me to research in one place or another. I think it's often about what are the interesting questions. So, would I go work in a country that I'd never worked in before? Yes, if I thought there were interesting comparative possibilities. Could this be compared to a place I had worked before, or do I have some novel insight to offer? But I, truth be told, I knew this before Botswana. I think when you begin work in a new place, there's a greater recognition that you're probably going to see things that you didn't anticipate. Quite different than a place you'd been working for several years. So. Probably a greater expectation that you might have to be flexible or make some shifts. And I think most funders or grant review committees are, it's evident in your proposal and your experience whether or not you've spent a lot of time there. So, if they chose to give you the money, it's because they probably think you have some novel insight or approach to offer.
Getting back to what you actually discovered here, I mean, if I heard what you were saying earlier right, the news you got from the research is, in a certain way, reasonably optimistic. That is, people are continuing to farm without much regard for market forces. They are continuing to maintain, they aren't expanding in ways that might lead to their downfall in years of low prices or change in demand. I guess still the crops they've been raising for a very long time. I'm just wondering, I mean, was the picture of the kind of conservatism of agriculture that you were encountering in a certain way an optimistic picture?
I mean, I understand that perspective. I think a bigger issue is that it's largely older women who continue to farm. Now, I think on the one hand that maybe that's not such a bad thing. So, in the United States, well, it had been 2% of the population still farms. I think it's now down to 1%. And you might just say that as an economy evolves and develops, that, farming will go by the wayside. You'll just have a couple big factory farms that feed everyone. And that, the ideal development trajectory is that we all get office jobs and work in the city. So you have to think, well, is this what's happening in Botswana? Is this just the normal course of development? Fewer and fewer people are going to farm. And Botswana, to its credit, does spend a lot on education. It has one of the highest literacy rates for a country in the tropics in the world. It's like 85%. So, I think there are many people in Botswana who would say that this should become a very highly educated population that will, Gaborone, the capital city, will become a financial hub and it will provide banking services for Southern Africa. That's one vision. And I certainly think that could happen. But I think parallel to that, that form of development will always leave some people behind. And so if one is to think about a diverse economy, an economy that is concerned about the rural poor, about the urban poor, then I think there will be a continuing role for some form of agriculture. So I think what our research may end up showing is that agriculture is still important even in a highly successful middle-income African country. And it's important because it's a safety net for the poor, and that it's not acceptable to have people going hungry in that context. And I think even in the United States, there are some people that are beginning to think about agriculture in a very different way, that there's space for smaller scale agriculture, for organic agriculture. In the Twin Cities, we have a big Hmong community that traditionally farms, and a lot of them, you see them at farmers markets. And so that's that's another livelihood that we shouldn't necessarily sacrifice to a kind of modernist view of development.
Well, in the United States, in Minnesota, there are romantics who are going back to farm.
Mm-hmm.
People who got sick of the cubicle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to spend my summer interviewing, that sort of romantic in southwest Minnesota. So, is there anything in Africa or in Botswana that's fostering that kind of romance with village life, with agriculture, anything to make farming look like something else except the sort of thing that old people do because they can't do anything else?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a fair point. I do think as academics or as urbanites who haven't spent their life on the land, it's very easy to romanticize rural life as kind of bucolic, and farming is hard. It's really hard work, and in some sense, you can't blame people for wanting to get out of a hard existence, which is very risky in terms of weather patterns. So I think we have to look at it in a realistic way that recognizes that it's not an easy occupation, but if you are operating in a situation of persistent poverty, high levels of unemployment, I think it needs to continue to be explored as a potential occupation. And I met and interviewed a lot of people that, despite the hard work, I think appreciated the fact that they had independence, that they had a know-how and experience with the land that they could use to feed their family in part or in whole.
Is that getting passed down to the next generation?
Well, it's not, in the sense that the majority of farmers are these older women, and I do think there's a bit of a kind of modernist vision which says that if you go to school and are successful, you shouldn't be a farmer. You should have an office job, I think there's a space for small, kind of entrepreneurial, savvy farmers. If you enjoy doing that's okay. It's not a kind of a step backward.
But I take it there isn't. I mean, one of the ways that people tried to combat this flight to the city stuff in the United States, but things like 4-H, things like agricultural extension, things like ag schools, various ways of giving people a respect for agricultural activity. And I'm wondering if people see, and if at education, at public policy levels, people see a need for that kind of institution.
So to be fair to the government of Botswana, they have a big Ministry of Agriculture, which has a large extension staff. A lot of that is focused on animal husbandry and cattle rearing, which makes sense in a semi-arid country. But the majority of the agricultural field workers are male, and the majority of farmers today in Botswana are female. And for cultural reasons, a lot of male extension workers or field workers can only kind of interact with women at arm's length. So that's one issue. Okay, I think if your farming population is largely female, it makes sense to have a field staff which is largely female. And then I also think that there's a particular vision of agriculture which is highly mechanized, energy intensive, chemical intensive, and that one could engage with farmers using a broader set of acceptable models. That like everybody doesn't have to be a big commercial farmer. That there are other ways to go about farming, and that those are valuable too. So, you know, part of the issue here is it's a country undergoing a significant social transformation. It's becoming urbanized. People are getting more educated, and they're leaving rural areas. But I also think the government's approach to promoting agriculture has been overly male-dominated and overly focused on one modernist vision of agriculture, and that if agricultural extension changed, they might be more successful at promoting and sustaining agriculture.
We've left out one aspect of your experience, and in the last couple minutes, maybe this is the point to bring it in. That's your teaching.
Yes.
So
I was hoping you would.
What
ask
would
me
happen
about
with it? What happened with that? And what did your students make of this as they watched this situation?
So this is the third time I've taught a study abroad program. The previous 2 times were in South Africa, and that was just for a J term. So it was wonderful to go and to be in Botswana for an entire semester, just not for a month. And I had 14 students, 14 American students with me, and at University of Botswana is a highly functional African university. So my students had 2 courses with me. They studied the local language Setswana, and then they took another elective course at the university. But the focus of my course was on globalization, the environment, and development, and which is my research area, and a big part of that is agriculture and land management. And I do the very enjoyable thing about teaching in a study abroad program for an international scholar is that it's much easier to bring in your research themes. And I do continue to believe in a model of the teacher-scholar, that teaching is a craft that needs to be taken seriously, but I think it's useful if the teacher is also engaged in the knowledge creation process, and that if you can bring students into that. So if we're in the Twin Cities and I'm teaching, I've always been envious of my colleagues who are like urban geographers, and they can take their students to Frogtown and look at businesses on University Avenue, whereas my teaching is always somewhat more abstract because I tend to be talking about places on the other side of the planet. So the real joy of taking students with me to Botswana and simultaneously doing research is that I could bring those issues into the classroom as I was encountering them in the field. And we could talk about a set of issues in class and then go out and actually see them. So, for example, in Botswana we had a unit on ecotourism. So we looked at, parks and problems with the park model and issues with communities that live around parks. And then at midterm break, we took 9 days and we went up to the Okavango Delta, which is an area in northern northern Botswana, very rich in wildlife, and we visited the parks, and we were in and out of some of the communities around those parks, and so we got to see those issues firsthand and explore them with the students. And that's, as an international scholar, that's just a real joy. It's something I can't do in the classroom at home. And I think also being situated at the University of Botswana. I was a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science. I got to interact with Botswana colleagues there, and that was wonderful to spend time in another university setting and to interact with colleagues from a different place.
Thank you.